The trail leading to Dunrock vanished twice before I reached the ridge, first swallowed by bramble, then by an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against my ears. The locals had warned me not to come, claiming the land down in that hollow remembers things, but the letters I carried in my pack burned with a stronger pull. Their pages, brittle and smudged with coal dust, spoke of a night no one survived, a night when the earth itself seemed to draw a breath. The discovery of the letters began not with intention, but with a collapse of shelving in the archives of the State Historical Annex. The researcher had come seeking geological survey maps, nothing more than brittle diagrams of strata and mineral estimates for a long-forgotten mining region. But when the shelf gave way, spilling a century of dust and neglected documents across the floor, something small and tightly bundled slid free from the debris. It was wrapped in oilcloth, darkened almost to black by age, and bound with twine so stiff it crumbled at her touch. The bundle was surprisingly heavy, as though the paper inside had absorbed far more than ink and time. The researcher hesitated before opening it, feeling oddly as if she were violating something private, but curiosity carried more weight than caution. Inside were letters, more than a dozen, each written in the same jagged handwriting, the strokes sharp and frantic even where the ink had faded to pale brown ghosting. The dates were clustered across only 7 months in 1891, each letter addressed to someone whose name had been violently scratched out, leaving only ragged scars in the paper. The earliest letters began mundanely enough, mentions of long shifts in the Dunrock mine, supply shortages, odd weather patterns settling over the valley. But even in those early pages, there was a thread of tension, a tremor beneath the mundane details, as though the writer had already sensed something stirring beneath the surface of the earth though he lacked the words to name it. By the third letter, the tone shifted. The writer described strange acoustics in the lower shafts, sounds that mimicked voices too faint to distinguish. He insisted they were not echoes, for echoes required an original sound, and no one had spoken. He wrote of shadows moving where there should have been none, and of the miners' growing reluctance to work the deepest tunnels. His sentences grew shorter, more urgent, as if written quickly between breaths. The researcher noted that the ink became darker in these letters, almost as though the writer pressed harder, or perhaps used a different mixture altogether, one that left a faint metallic scent lingering on the paper. Midway through the bundle, the letters became fragmented, as though the writer had begun drafting them in moments of panic. Lines broke abruptly. Entire paragraphs dissolved into smudges, as if the writer's hands trembled too violently to hold the pen. There were references to symbols carved in rock where no one had carved, and to tremors felt only by those standing directly above certain parts of town. The final letter ended halfway through a sentence, the ink trailing off into a jagged line that cut diagonally across the page before stopping cold. The coal whispers began as nothing more than an oddity, an easily dismissed quirk of acoustics in a mine already known for its labyrinth of narrow tunnels and uneven stone. At first, the miners attributed the sounds to shifting pressure pockets or the long, hollow moan of wind drawn through fissures far above their working shafts. But those explanations unraveled quickly. The voices were too distinct, too deliberate in their cadence, rising and falling with an eerie conversational rhythm that could not be mistaken for natural noise. Some claimed they heard their own names spoken softly from the darkness, carried on a breath of air that felt strangely warm against the cold stone. It wasn't just the words, or the illusion of them, that unsettled the men. It was the source. The voices always came from tunnels no one had entered, from unmined passages that, according to the maps nailed to the foreman's wall, did not exist at all. The miners would shine their lamps toward the direction of the sound, expecting to catch the glint of another worker's helmet or the shifting silhouette of someone approaching. Instead, the light dissolved into blackness as if swallowed whole, the beam weakening inexplicably the deeper it probed. No echo returned, not even the usual thin reverberation that stone corridors typically provided, just an oppressive silence that seemed to throb with something unseen. As the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder, more numerous, as though additional speakers had joined an invisible gathering beneath the earth. Some miners insisted the voices were attempting to mimic human speech but failing, producing sounds that hovered just on the edge of language but never fully crossed into comprehension. Others were convinced the words were perfectly clear, though they refused to repeat what they believed they'd heard, their eyes darting toward the shaft entrance as if afraid something might be listening. A few claimed the whispers began only after they'd spent long hours underground, suggesting exhaustion or gas exposure, but tests showed no irregularities, and even the foreman, known for his dismissal of superstition, was forced to admit the phenomena were occurring during all shifts, under all conditions. The fear spread subtly, threading itself between the workers during their breaks, shaping the way they glanced at shadowed corners or paused before entering deeper tunnels. Tools clattered more often from trembling hands, and conversations carried a muted, brittle quality, as though everyone was trying to avoid drawing attention from whatever lurked beneath them. Lamps were kept burning longer than necessary, their flames trembling in unseen drafts. Eventually, some refused to work alone at all, insisting the whispers grew closest when no one else was near, as if the unseen voices preferred solitude and would drift closer when given the chance to be heard more clearly without interference from the living nearby. The first collapse occurred during a routine shift, though nothing about that day felt routine to the men who later recounted it. The miners had been working a section of the lower shaft that had always been considered stable, reinforced with fresh timber supports and inspected only the week before. Yet as they chipped away at a new seam, a tremor pulsed through the ground, subtle at first, like the faint quiver of a heartbeat felt through the soles of their boots. Tools paused mid-strike. The lanterns hanging from hooks rattled against the walls with a soft, metallic clatter. Before anyone could call out a warning, the tremor intensified into a shudder that roared through the stone, followed by a violent crack that split the support beam nearest the face of the wall. The collapse came not as a sudden explosion of rubble but as a strangely measured sinking, as though the earth had softened beneath the rock and allowed it to fold inward. Dust billowed through the shaft, choking the men and plunging them into darkness as lantern flames sputtered. When the dust settled enough for them to relight their lamps, they found that the cave-in had not simply blocked their progress, it had revealed something wholly unexpected. Where rough, natural stone should have been was instead an opening into a chamber none of them could explain, a space too symmetrical, too deliberate in its design to be the product of geological chance. The chamber's walls were smooth and curved, meeting each other in a formation that seemed almost organic, like the interior of a vast ribcage carved from polished coal. Strange symbols were etched across the surfaces, shallow grooves that glimmered faintly in the lantern light, as though absorbing and releasing the glow in slow pulses. The markings did not resemble letters or numbers or any known script. They twisted and bent in patterns that made the miners' eyes ache if they stared too long, as if the shapes resisted being understood. A few men swore the symbols shifted when they looked away, subtly altering their arrangement, though none dared say so aloud for fear of being dismissed as frightened or delirious. The air inside the chamber felt different from the surrounding mine, thicker, warmer, carrying a faint vibration that seemed to hum through the lungs of anyone who breathed it. One miner stepped forward, drawn toward the center of the space, but stopped abruptly when his lantern flickered and died without warning. The others watched as the darkness swallowed him up to the waist before the flame sputtered back to life, revealing him pale and trembling, insisting something had brushed past him, though he could not say whether it had been solid or merely a sensation, like the whisper of breath against skin. The survivor they pulled from the collapse should never have been alive at all. When the rescue team reached him, he was wedged between slabs of fallen stone in a pocket barely large enough for a grown man to curl into. Yet he was upright, eyes wide open in the darkness, as though he had been waiting for someone to arrive. His clothes were shredded and coated in a black dust that didn't match the usual coal residue, finer and strangely iridescent when the lantern light struck it. Even before they freed him, the men sensed something was wrong. He wasn't coughing, though the air in the sealed pocket should have been thick with debris. He wasn't gasping or panicked or even grateful. He simply stared with a fixed intensity that made the rescuers hesitate before touching him. Once hauled back to the main shaft, he resisted when they tried to examine him, jerking away when hands neared his skin. It wasn't fear, they could see that immediately. It was something closer to agitation, a twitching restlessness that never left his limbs. His eyes darted constantly toward the direction of the collapsed chamber, as though he could still hear something calling from behind the rock. When the foreman demanded to know what had happened in there, the survivor spoke only one sentence, repeating it again and again, his voice rising to a frantic rasp: the stone was breathing. No amount of questioning, calming, or anger could coax anything else from him. As hours passed, his condition worsened in ways none of the men were prepared to witness. His skin, once pale beneath the dust, took on a faint, granular texture, as though something beneath the surface was pressing outward. Small patches darkened into mottled gray, rough to the touch like unfinished coal. When the doctor arrived from town and attempted to clean the dust from his arms, the survivor recoiled violently, screaming as though scalded. The water had not hurt him, the touch had. The doctor noted that the man's pulse was erratic, not fast or slow so much as uneven, thudding in strange rhythms that seemed to sync with the faint tremors occasionally shivering through the ground. By nightfall, the survivor's muscles jerked at random, his fingers curling and uncurling without command, his breath catching in short, shallow bursts that didn't match the rise and fall of his chest. He kept turning his head toward the mine entrance, tilting it as if listening to something only he could hear. The men who watched him swore they heard faint clicking sounds coming from his throat, too deliberate to be involuntary spasms, too soft to form words. And though the lamps were steady and the room was warm, he began to shiver, whispering through clenched teeth that whatever he had escaped from the collapse was not finished with him yet. The tremors that plagued Dunrock began subtly, a faint flutter beneath the floorboards that most residents initially mistook for distant thunder or the far-off rumble of passing carts. But the vibrations returned night after night, always after dusk, always concentrated in certain homes while leaving others untouched. At first, people chalked it up to the unstable ground near the mining district, assuming the ongoing excavation had weakened the soil. Yet the pattern made little sense. Some of the newest, sturdiest houses shuddered as if perched on the lip of a cliff, while older, poorly built cabins nearby remained perfectly still. The tremors did not travel. They selected. Families began to notice that the vibrations followed a strange rhythm, more like a slow, deliberate pulse than the rapid shaking of an ordinary quake. Plates trembled on shelves in a steady cadence. Doors creaked in patterns almost too measured to ignore. On some nights the tremors were so delicate they barely disturbed a candle flame, while on others they throbbed with enough force to rattle windows and wake sleeping children. Regardless of intensity, they always ceased precisely at dawn, vanishing the moment the first sliver of sunlight touched the valley. People started gathering on porches after sunset, listening with held breath to the quieting streets, waiting for the nightly stirring to begin. When the tremors rolled through, neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, each wondering whether their homes would be next. Some reported hearing faint noises beneath the floorboards during the shaking, not cracks or groans, but sounds closer to movement, like something shifting through soil just out of sight. Others claimed the vibration seemed to respond to them, intensifying when they stepped onto certain spots in their homes, as if whatever lay beneath was aware of their presence. The foreman of the mine insisted the tremors had nothing to do with underground work, pointing out that they occurred even on rest days. The town surveyor conducted tests and measurements, but his equipment registered nothing irregular. The ground was stable, he insisted, yet his hands trembled as he packed away his tools. When questioned further, he admitted that during one of the nocturnal episodes he felt the earth draw in, as though contracting rather than shaking. He refused to elaborate. As word spread, fear took root in small, quiet ways. Residents began placing water glasses beside their beds, watching for ripples to signal the tremor's approach. Mothers kept their children close after dusk. Lamps burned late into the night. There was a growing sense that the town was being probed, studied piece by something that moved without footsteps, breathed without lungs, and learned the layout of each home by touch alone. The preacher's warning came on a Sunday morning that should have felt ordinary, with sunlight filtering through the stained-glass windows and the faint smell of pine drifting in from the forest beyond the church. Yet even before he opened his mouth, a tension hung in the air, something that made the congregation shift uncomfortably in their pews. He stepped to the pulpit slowly, his hands trembling in a way that was visible even from the back rows. Those who knew him well sensed immediately that what he was about to say was not part of any planned sermon. His Bible lay unopened beside him, untouched, as though Scripture no longer offered language strong enough for what he had seen. He began by asking the congregation to listen without interruption, his voice thin but steady. He spoke of nights spent awake, not by choice but by a presence he could not name, a presence that seemed to seep through the floorboards of the rectory. At first, he had ignored the sensation, telling himself fatigue and imagination were playing tricks on him. But then came the dreams, if they could be called dreams at all. He described visions of the valley beneath the town sinking like a breathing lung, of shadows curling through the mine shafts like living tendrils, of symbols etched into the stone glowing faintly with each pulse of the trembling earth. He said he felt watched, not by human eyes nor by anything he could identify from Scripture, but by something older and deeper than any faith he had ever encountered. As the congregation murmured, he raised his hands to silence them. He admitted that fear had kept him from speaking sooner. But after the survivor from the collapse was brought into town, after the nightly tremors grew stronger, and after the voices in the mine spread through whispered gossip, he became convinced that whatever stirred beneath Dunrock was not merely geological. He told them he believed the ground itself was awakening, that something buried for centuries, or longer, had begun to stir, attracted or agitated by the relentless digging. He begged them to consider leaving, even temporarily, until the miners and surveyors could determine whether the valley was safe. His words were met with a mixture of alarm, disbelief, and quiet resentment. Most of the townspeople relied on the mine for their livelihood. Abandoning Dunrock, even briefly, felt unthinkable. Some accused him of fearmongering, insisting that a man of faith should stand against superstition rather than spread it. Others whispered that the preacher himself might be unwell, perhaps affected by the same strange malaise that had overtaken the survivor. A few, however, sat rigidly in their pews, eyes fixed on the shaking hands of the preacher, recognizing the unmistakable look of a man who had seen something that had stripped away certainty and left terror in its place. The disappearance of the animals began quietly, almost insignificantly, as though the valley were being drained of its smaller lives one by one. At first, no one noticed the missing chickens from the McCleary farm. They had always been prone to wandering too far from the coop. But then the goats vanished from the Larsons' pasture, leaving behind only a single, splintered fence post marked with deep gouges. The family dog belonging to the town seamstress failed to return home after an evening run, though the woman swore she heard him whining beneath her floorboards long after midnight. When she lifted the loose plank the next morning, there was nothing there, not even disturbed soil. It was as if the sound had come from deeper than any ordinary burrow could allow. What unnerved everyone most was the silence that followed each disappearance. No growls. No screams. No frantic hoofbeats fleeing a predator. Whatever was taking the animals did so without chaos, as though the valley itself simply decided to reclaim them. Yet signs of struggle appeared in strange and unsettling ways. Barn doors were found ajar in the mornings, though the latches were unbroken and the locks still engaged. Wooden beams bore claw-like marks that didn't match coyotes, wolves, or any known wildlife. Some farmers found holes in the ground where animals had vanished, not dug outward, but imploded inward, as though something beneath the soil had pulled them down with tremendous force. As the occurrences spread, fear crept into the town's routines. Livestock were kept indoors, guarded around the clock. Horses refused to approach certain parts of the pasture, snorting and stamping as though repelled by an unseen barrier. Cats arched their backs and hissed at empty corners, their fur standing straight up. Dogs howled at night in tones that sounded less like warning and more like mourning, long wavering notes that echoed through the streets and made sleep impossible. One night, several townspeople reported hearing a chorus of panicked animals from somewhere below the surface, muffled and distant, the sound vibrating up through the earth in wavering bursts. The next morning, traps set around barns were found crushed inward, metal bent like soft clay. Some residents insisted that the claw marks gouged into stable doors pointed inward, not outward, as if something had tried to drag the doors into the space beyond them rather than break them open. By then, even the most skeptical citizens could no longer dismiss the pattern. The valley was emptying itself of creatures with senses far sharper than any humans, animals that had fled or fought or vanished before people fully understood there was something to fear. And in the absence of their familiar presence, no morning crows, no paw prints in the dust, no neighs or bleats carried on the wind, the town felt strangely hollow, as though Dunrock itself were waiting for its next offering. The deep survey team was assembled after the council could no longer ignore the miners' reports or the increasingly erratic tremors beneath Dunrock. Unlike the regular workers, these men were specialists, geologists, structural experts, and seasoned explorers accustomed to navigating unstable subterranean systems. They arrived with crates of instruments the townsfolk had never seen before, devices with tuning forks that vibrated in response to hidden cavities, metal rods used to detect shifts in pressure, lanterns that burned with a whiter, sharper flame. Their presence alone made the townspeople uneasy. It suggested an urgency that no one wanted to acknowledge aloud. The team descended into the mine just after dawn, hoping to avoid the strange atmospheric changes that seemed strongest at night. As they moved deeper, the air turned heavier, settling on their lungs with a humid weight that didn't match the dry upper tunnels. They passed abandoned equipment left behind after the collapse, shattered lantern glass, twisted rails, pickaxes embedded in stone as if driven by impossible force. Yet the most unsettling detail was the absolute quiet. No dust drifted from the beams overhead, no distant echoes carried from other shafts. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath. When they reached the area of the cave-in, they expected to chart the damage and plan a safe clearing route. Instead, they discovered that the fallen rock had shifted again overnight, not in a way consistent with natural settling but in a pattern that suggested something from beneath had pushed upward. The chamber revealed during the initial collapse was now partially exposed, its smooth, curved interior visible through a jagged opening. The symbols carved into its walls pulsed faintly in the lantern light, causing several members of the team to instinctively step back. Still, they pressed on, documenting everything. The geologist took measurements of the vibrations and frowned. The reading suggested hollow spaces deep below them, vast ones, that did not align with any known mapping of the region. Using a resonance tool, they sent a series of pulses into the rock. The sound should have returned immediately with a sharp echo. Instead, it was swallowed completely, disappearing into a depth that seemed to have no measurable end. One of the men, startled, repeated the test and insisted he heard something echo back after a long delay, not the expected chime of metal on stone but a low, resonant tone that reminded him of a distant moan. They ventured farther, following a narrow crack that had opened since the collapse. When their lanterns illuminated the cavern ahead, the entire group froze. Before them yawned a chasm that had not existed days earlier, its edges smooth and unnaturally symmetrical, as though carved by something with intention rather than force. The darkness inside was complete, a depth so absolute that even the brightest flames seemed to recoil from it. The team exchanged glances, professionals, all of them, trained to explain anomalies rationally, yet none could muster an explanation for what they had found. In that silent moment, one of them whispered that the ground felt as if it were listening. The first time someone described the sound beneath Dunrock as breathing, most dismissed it as embellishment born from sleepless nights and jittery nerves. But soon more voices echoed the claim, each describing the same slow, rhythmic inhalation rising from the soil itself. It began faintly, little more than a subtle pressure shift in the air, like standing beside a slumbering animal whose lungs expanded and contracted in deep, deliberate motion. What unsettled people most was that the sound didn't travel. It stayed fixed to certain places, the floor of a kitchen, a patch of yard, a stretch of road near the mine, each one behaving like the chest of something hidden just below. No one could determine when, exactly, the breathing began. Some insisted it had always been there, masked by the busyness of daily life until fear sharpened their senses enough to hear it. Others claimed it started the same night the deep survey team entered the lower tunnels, as though their intrusion had drawn something closer to the surface. Regardless, the phenomenon grew with astonishing speed. At first, only a handful of residents heard it. Within a week, nearly every home reported moments when the ground beneath them seemed to expand, pause, and release a low, rumbling exhale that made floorboards vibrate and lantern flames waver. The rhythm was wrong. Human breathing was too fast, too shallow. This was slower, deeper, as if produced by lungs the size of canyons, drawing in the entire valley with each cycle. The inhalations caused windows to flex inward ever so slightly, producing soft ticks and groans that accumulated into a discordant chorus. The exhalations were worse, releasing a warm gust through cracks in the floor that carried a scent like damp stone and cold metal. On rare occasions, the breath carried something else, a faint whispering undertone, not quite words, but patterns that almost formed them. People froze when they heard it, their bodies reacting with a primal dread they couldn't rationalize. Those who lived closest to the mine noticed the breathing intensified just before dawn. The ground would swell with such force that dishes rattled on shelves and chairs crept imperceptibly across the floor. The moment sunlight touched the ridge, the phenomenon stopped, as if whatever lay beneath sank deeper into the earth to avoid the day. Parents began keeping their children indoors during those early morning hours, afraid the ground might open beneath small, unsuspecting feet. Some nights, the breathing aligned with the tremors that had plagued Dunrock for weeks, creating an unsettling syncopation that left residents clutching their beds, feeling as though they were lying atop the ribcage of something awakening. A few swore they felt the pulse of a heartbeat beneath the inhalations. Others claimed that when they pressed an ear to the ground, they heard movement, slow, dragging, deliberate, like a massive body shifting into a more comfortable position just below the surface of their town. The mass hallucinations began on a night when the sky was unusually clear, the stars sharp and cold above the valley. People later said there had been a heaviness in the air hours beforehand, a tightness that made it hard to swallow, as though the atmosphere had thickened into something closer to liquid. Most residents were already awake from the tremors and the strange breathing beneath their floors, so when an unnatural stillness settled over Dunrock, they noticed it immediately. Lamps flickered without wind. Dogs that hadn't vanished yet whined and pressed themselves against doors. Then, as if summoned by some silent cue, everyone who happened to be looking toward the mountains saw the same impossible thing. A silhouette rose behind the dark ridge, not a man, not an animal, but a towering shape that dwarfed the highest pine trees. It appeared not with the suddenness of a jump scare but with the slow inevitability of sunrise, emerging inch by inch as though pushed upward by the earth itself. The figure had no discernible features at first, just an immense outline against the starlit sky, as if something solid was blocking the constellations. The shape swayed slightly, not like a shadow cast by clouds but like a colossal being adjusting its weight. A wave of cold spread through the town as the figure's edges sharpened, suggesting a head, a bowed shoulder, perhaps even limbs curled close to its body. And then came the sound, a distant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the bones rather than the air. Some swore it was a groan. Others insisted it was a chant. A few claimed they heard nothing at all but felt the vibration echoing through their ribs, like the aftershock of an immense heartbeat. The town held its breath, though no one commanded it to. Lamps dimmed. Horses in their stalls reared and thrashed. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed on windows in patterns resembling branching veins. Just as slowly as it had risen, the silhouette began to sink back behind the ridge. But the sinking didn't look like normal descent, it looked as though the figure was being pulled downward, swallowed by the very earth from which it had emerged. Its outline stretched and warped as it descended, thinning into a distorted taper before finally vanishing entirely. Once it was gone, the night resumed with such abrupt normalcy that several residents screamed, not from the vision itself but from the shock of the world snapping back into place. The next morning, when townspeople gathered to discuss what they'd witnessed, they found their descriptions eerily identical despite being spoken by people who hadn't stood near one another at the time. Those who hadn't seen the silhouette themselves reported feeling watched all night, as though the fading starlight still held the imprint of something massive pressed against it, waiting for darkness to return. The disappearance of Dunrock's children became the moment the town's unspoken dread crystallized into full terror, not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. It happened on a night already thick with unease, the kind of night when the tremors came in slow, irregular beats and the ground's breathing seemed louder than usual, rising through bedroom floors like warm, rhythmic gusts. Parents later recalled waking multiple times, unsettled by the shifting air and by the strange, intermittent tapping that traveled through walls in no identifiable pattern. Yet when they checked on their children, each one slept soundly, their blankets rising and falling in peaceful cadence, undisturbed by the strange activity in the valley. The first scream came from the Miller house shortly before dawn. Mrs. Miller had risen early to prepare breakfast and found her daughter's bed perfectly made, as if the child had never slept in it at all. Not a crease disturbed the blankets. Not a pillow was out of place. At nearly the same moment across town, similar cries erupted from other homes, the same frantic calls, the same disbelief. Doors that had been locked from the inside remained bolted. Windows were latched without so much as a smudge. Some homes had rugs that would have shown footprints or scuff marks, yet nothing indicated movement. The children were simply gone. Panic rippled through Dunrock with a speed that made the morning blur into chaos. Parents sprinted from house to house, calling out names that dissolved into the cold air. The sheriff organized a search, but even he seemed shaken by the uniformity of the disappearances. Every child had vanished within the same hour, leaving behind only the eerie impression that they had not been taken, but absorbed, or erased. Search parties combed the woods, the abandoned mining tracts, the riverbanks. Bloodhounds were brought out, but they refused to take a scent, whining and pulling away from the children's doorways as if repelled by something only they could sense. More disturbing were the sounds people reported hearing in the minutes just before sunrise. Several adults swore they heard faint footsteps moving beneath their homes, light and quick like those of children running. Others claimed they heard soft knocking from under the floorboards, rhythmic and insistent, timed almost perfectly with the rumbling inhalations of the earth. The few who dared to kneel and press their ears to the ground recoiled almost immediately, insisting they heard muffled laughter below, distant, echoing, and wrong in a way that made their stomachs twist. By midday, the horrifying stillness that followed confirmed what everyone feared. The valley, which had already taken animals, sound, and sanity, had now taken something far more precious. And though the search continued until nightfall, no trail appeared, no footprints emerged, and no whisper of the missing children carried on the wind. It felt as though Dunrock had been emptied of its future in a single, silent sweep. The collapse of the main shaft occurred with a violence that defied everything the townspeople believed they understood about their mine. For weeks, tremors had rattled the valley, but nothing suggested the catastrophic failure that struck just after dusk. The night was unusually still when the first deep crack reverberated through the stone, a low groan that rolled across the ground like distant thunder. The few miners still on site barely had time to exchange uneasy glances before the earth convulsed beneath them. Lanterns swung wildly from their hooks, flinging shadows that jittered across the walls as the ground buckled in a sudden, sickening lurch. The collapse didn't resemble the chaotic cascade of rubble typical of failing supports. Instead, the ground seemed to fold inward with uncanny precision, as though some force below had drawn the tunnels toward a single point. Timber supports snapped not outward but inward, pulled in like brittle ribs crushed by a massive hand. The air filled with a deafening rush of displaced earth, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Dust billowed from the mine entrance in thick, roiling clouds that carried an acrid, metallic scent, prompting the rescue teams to hesitate before entering. When they finally ventured inside, their lantern light revealed devastation unlike anything they'd encountered. Entire corridors had been compacted into narrow, twisted passages. Stone that should have fractured into jagged shards was instead crushed smooth, flattened as though compressed by a weight beyond natural explanation. More disturbing were the structures found protruding from the debris, thin, lattice-like columns of fused stone and timber, forming shapes that resembled the branching frameworks of bones. The rescuers stared in horrified disbelief, unable to explain how wood and rock could melt together so seamlessly, as if softened and reformed under unimaginable heat. Yet no scorch marks marred the surfaces. The fusion appeared cold, deliberate, and disturbingly organic. The deeper the rescuers pushed, the more unnatural the formations became. Narrow arches rose from the rubble, curving overhead like elongated vertebrae. In some places, the floor rippled subtly, as though the stone had flowed rather than shattered. A few men refused to go farther, insisting the shapes felt wrong, too structured to be accidents of a collapse. Those who continued found the deepest tunnels sealed completely, not by fallen rock, but by walls that looked grown rather than built, smooth, dark, and pulsing faintly with warmth. No survivors were found. Tools lay half buried in the strangely molded debris, some bent into curves that defied the strength of human arms. A single lantern remained lit near the lowest accessible point, its flame steady despite the charged stillness in the air. One of the rescuers, unable to stop staring at the bone-like lattice overhead, whispered that the mine hadn't collapsed at all. It had been closed. The nights after the collapse became saturated with a quiet dread that seemed to seep from the soil itself, and people began reporting sightings that defied any rational explanation. These weren't fleeting glimpses or distant silhouettes that could be dismissed as tricks of the moonlight, they were clear, close, and unmistakably connected to whatever now stirred beneath the town. It began with a farmer who lived on the outskirts, a man known for his sober temperament and disdain for superstition. He claimed that while walking home from his barn just after sunset, he saw something crouched along the tree line, tall enough to peer over the top rail fence, yet folded in on itself as though hiding. Its limbs were too long, its posture too still, and the shape of its head was wrong, tapering slightly as if stretched. He stared at it for several seconds before it slipped effortlessly back into the trees without making a sound. The next morning, he found deep impressions in the soil, spaced too far apart to belong to any known creature, as though whatever made them walked by planting only the tips of its elongated feet. Another sighting came from a pair of teenagers who had been sneaking out to meet by the old water tower. They insisted they saw a figure standing perfectly still on the roof of the abandoned shed nearby, tall, narrow, and shadowed against the moon. When they whispered to each other, its head rotated toward them with slow, unnatural deliberation, though its body didn't move at all. Terrified, they fled, swearing they heard it shift behind them, the soft scrape of something hard dragging across metal. More reports flooded in over the following days. A woman hauling firewood glimpsed a pale shape pressed against her kitchen window, its face, or what passed for a face, flat and featureless except for a slight protrusion where a mouth might be. A hunter in the woods encountered a figure crouched in the hollow of a fallen tree, its limbs bent at alarming angles, its torso expanding and contracting with a breath too deep, too measured. The hunter claimed the thing watched him without eyes, yet he felt its attention like a hand on his chest, heavy and probing. The most chilling account came from a small group searching near the collapsed mine entrances. Just as dawn broke, they saw a tall silhouette standing on the ridge, positioned so perfectly between two rock formations that it might have been carved there. But it wasn't stone, they knew it even before it slowly tilted its head, the motion almost curious. The figure stood impossibly still, its form slightly distorted, as if the air around it bent. And then, without warning, it dissolved into the early morning haze, not fading, but folding, collapsing inward like a shadow retreating into a crack. By then, the town understood these were not hallucinations, nor mass imaginations born of fear. Whatever had risen from the mine was not confined to the depths anymore, and it had begun to walk among them. Strange sounds began echoing up from the sealed tunnels, sounds that bore no resemblance to the groans and rumbles of shifting earth that had once been so familiar to the miners. These noises were sharper, more deliberate, almost patterned, as though someone, or something, was moving with intention in the depths. At first, the town tried to dismiss them as aftershocks or settling debris, but the sounds persisted and grew in complexity. They carried an uncanny cadence, occasionally resembling muffled footsteps, then abruptly shifting into rhythmic tapping like knuckles or claws striking stone in a sequence too measured to be accidental. At other times, the noise rose into a low humming that vibrated through the soil, faint yet penetrating, leaving people with the unsettling feeling that their bones were resonating with it. Those living closest to the mine reported that the sounds were clearest between midnight and dawn. Doors and windows rattled in response to pulses of vibration that swept through the ground in slow, rolling waves. Some claimed they could hear faint voices, though no two people agreed on what the voices said. A few described the sound as whispering filtered through layers of rock, while others insisted it was more like chanting, a deep, guttural chorus rising and falling as if part of a ritual. The descriptions varied wildly, yet they all shared a single thread: no one who heard the voices felt they were meant for human ears. The town council attempted to investigate, sending a small team of volunteers equipped with lanterns and rope. They approached the entrance at dusk and paused when they felt a cold surge of air exhale from the darkness, too forceful to be a simple draft. The lantern flames narrowed and bent inward as though drawn toward the sealed tunnels. When the volunteers stepped closer, the rhythmic tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed heavily against their ears. Then came a slow, scraping sound, like something large dragging itself along the stone floor far below. The group retreated in a panic, convinced they had woken whatever had been listening. As the nights passed, the noises grew bolder. Vibrations shuddered through the valley with increasing strength, disturbing livestock and startling residents awake. House foundations trembled with a regularity that felt intentional, like a pulse matching some unseen heartbeat below. The ground itself seemed to breathe, rising and falling ever so slightly, as if the earth's surface were merely a thin membrane stretched over a restless body. Soon, even those who had once dismissed the stories grew uneasy. The mine was no longer a tomb or a cautionary ruin. It had become a mouth, one that exhaled, whispered, listened, and waited. The final surge of activity beneath Dunrock arrived without warning, sweeping through the valley in a single, violent upheaval that felt less like an earthquake and more like the awakening of something vast and ancient. It began with a sudden, crushing pressure in the air, a force so intense that people staggered as though shoved from all sides at once. Lanterns burst, windows fractured outward, and the trees along the ridge bowed in unison as if pushed down by an invisible hand. Then the ground convulsed. Not in chaotic shudders but in a single, fluid motion, rippling like a sheet of fabric being snapped taut. Every structure in town groaned at the same moment, the wood and metal singing with tension as though the valley itself were being drawn inward toward some unseen center. A deep roar rose from below, not a sound, but a physical force that pressed against the skin and hammered through the chest. Animals fled wildly, bolting in frantic arcs that made no sense, their movements panicked and erratic as though trying to escape from every direction at once. The earth around the mine swelled upward in a heaving mound before splitting open along jagged seams, releasing a plume of dust so thick it blotted out the stars. Out of that darkness emerged the same unnatural humming that had haunted the nights, now amplified to a monstrous harmony that vibrated through the teeth and skull. Some people clutched their heads, certain that the sound was burrowing straight into their minds. Others fell to their knees, unable to remain standing as the ground pitched beneath them. From within the widening fissure, faint shapes flickered, elongated forms that shifted as though swimming through the dust. They never fully emerged, but their presence was unmistakable. Every time the dust thinned, several tall silhouettes became briefly visible, towering and impossibly thin, their movements more like the folding and unfolding of shadows than the locomotion of any physical creature. They seemed to waver at the boundary of the opening, not stepping out but pressing closer, as though testing the strength of whatever thin veil separated the below from the surface. Then, just as suddenly as the chaos had begun, everything froze. The humming ceased mid-note. The ground stilled. The pressure in the air vanished, replaced by a hollow quiet so complete that people could hear their own pulse echoing in their ears. The dust settled slowly, revealing that the fissure had sealed itself as neatly as a wound pulled shut. The silhouettes were gone. Not a single figure or trace of movement remained. What lingered instead was an awful certainty, shared instinctively by everyone who had witnessed the eruption: the valley had been probed, measured, surveyed. Whatever lived beneath Dunrock had not attempted to fully emerge that night. It had only tested the barrier, and found it fragile.